Let me quote you. Elliot Cohen served as a counselor to Condoleezza Rice when she was the Secretary of State. And he writes this in the Atlantic magazine. He says, the United States and its NATO allies are engaged in a proxy war with Russia. They are supplying thousands of munitions and hopefully doing much else, sharing intelligence, for example, with the intent of killing Russian soldiers. And because fighting is, as the military theorist Karl von Clausewitz said, a trial of moral and physical forces through the medium of the latter, we must face a fact. To break the will of Russia and free Ukraine from conquest and subjugation, many Russian soldiers have to flee, surrender, or die, and the more and faster, the better. That's Elliot Cohen, former State Department advisor in the Atlantic. I'm wondering your response to that, especially him calling, just openly declaring that the U.S. is using Ukraine for what he calls a proxy war against Russia.
Well, Professor Cohen is a very honest man, which is to his credit. And therefore his adherence to neoconservative objectives is entirely transparent. And what he just said, what you quoted him as saying, is consistent with the neoconservative objective of regime change in Russia. And it's also consistent with fighting to the last Ukrainian to achieve it. I find it deplorable. But I have to say, it's probably representative of a very large body of opinion in Washington.
And why? Why does this view of Ukraine as essentially cannon fodder against Russia, why is it so prevalent in Washington?
This is essentially cost-free for the United States. As long as we don't cross some Russian red line that leads to escalation against us, we are engaged, as Professor Cohen said, in a proxy war. And we're selling a lot of weapons. That makes arms manufacturers happy. We're supporting a valiant resistance, which gives politicians something to crow about. We're going against an officially designated enemy, Russia, which makes us feel vindicated. So from the point of view of those with these self-interested views of the issue, this is a freebie.
And as someone with extensive experience in China, you served as President Nixon's interpreter when he did his historic visit to China. I'm wondering what you make of China's response to Russia's invasion so far and these warnings that they've been receiving in recent days from the Biden administration, trying to basically tell them not to help out Russia or else there will be consequences.
Well, this has been fascinating to watch. The Chinese clearly agree with Mr. Putin and Russian nationalists in objecting to NATO enlargement. Having been subjected to foreign spheres of influence in the 19th and 20th century, they don't like them. They don't believe Ukraine should be part of either the Russian or the US sphere of influence. They are the last citadel of Westphalianism in the world. They really do believe strongly in sovereignty and territorial integrity. Mr. Putin went to Beijing for the Winter Olympics and had a long discussion with Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, and they agreed that NATO should not enlarge, there should not be spheres of influence, and that the security architecture in Europe needed to be adjusted to relieve Russia of the sense of menace that it experiences. I don't believe for a minute that Mr. Putin told Mr. Xi that he planned to invade Ukraine. In fact, he may have said he had no intention of doing it. I don't know. He may indeed have had no intention of doing it at that point, assuming that his coercive diplomacy was going to get a response. But of course, it got no response. It got an evasive set of counter proposals about arms control which didn't address the main question he was raising, which was how Russia could feel secure when a hostile alliance was advancing to its very borders. Anyway, poor Mr. Xi Jinping now has to straddle something he probably almost certainly had no idea was in prospect. On the one hand, he can oppose spheres of influence and demand consideration for the security concerns of great powers, as he does with regard to Russia and with regard to his own country. But on the other hand, Ukraine is being violated. So the Chinese have had an awkward straddle. The irony is, I don't think this was intended, but inadvertently, this has put them in a position where they're one of the few countries that might conceivably mediate an end to the fighting. And I noticed that recently the Chinese have emphasized heavily the need for there to be negotiations to bring the fighting to an end at the earliest possible moment. It doesn't mean that they're going to end up mediating. Mediation is a very difficult thing, and often mediators enter the mediation with two friends and end up with two enemies. So this is not something you take on lightly. At this point, however, I would just say nobody knows what's going on between, or at least nobody who, if anybody does know, they're not saying what's going on between Russians and Ukrainians in the meetings that they are having. The Turks claim that the two sides are close to an agreement. Various points, Lavrov and Kubela, the Ukrainian foreign minister, have both said something similar, but there is no agreement. And it's not clear at this point whether there can be an agreement. By taking the land corridor from Donetsk to Crimea, Mr. Putin has taken something that he probably will be very unwilling to give up. And as I said, you ask Ukrainians to accept neutrality when they've been battered around the way they have been and lost all the lives and property that they have. It's not at all easy for them. So even though from the very beginning the solution has been obvious, which is some variant of the Austrian State Treaty of 1955, meaning a guaranteed independence in return for two things: one, decent treatment of minorities inside the guaranteed state, and second, neutrality for the guaranteed state. This has been there this is still the objective as far as we can tell, but it's been made more difficult rather than less by the outbreak of war.
What's your sense of the agency and the free reign that Zelensky actually has to make decisions and the extent of U.S. influence over him? One of the things that Professor Stephen F. Cohen warned about, the late Professor Stephen F. Cohen warned about, to me in 2019, was that unless the U.S. steps up and supports Zelensky in his mandate of making peace with the rebels in the East, then he has no chance, because otherwise he'll have to submit to the far right inside Ukraine, who are very influential. And since then, I've seen no indication there has been any sort of support from Washington for making peace with Russia. Trump, of course, was impeached when he paused those weapons sales. There's that famous incident where Lindsey Graham and John McCain and Amy Klobuchar go to the front lines in late 2016 of the Ukrainian military's fight against the rebels in the Donbass. And Lindsey Graham says 2017 is going to be the year of offense, and Russia has to pay a heavier price.
Your fight is our fight.
Ваша боротьба – це наша боротьба.
2017 will be the year of offense.
2016 рік буде ріком нападу.
All of us will go back to Washington and we will push the case against Russia.
Ми всі повернемося до Вашингтону і ми будемо відстоювати санкції проти Росії.
Enough of a Russian aggression.
Досить вже російської агресії.
It is time for them to pay a heavier price.
Час вже, щоб вони заплатили важчу ціну.
I believe you will win. I am convinced you will win, and we will do everything we can to provide you with what you need to win.
Even fast forward to when Biden came in, Time magazine reported that when Zelensky shut down the three leading opposition TV networks in Ukraine, that was conceived as a welcome gift to the Biden administration to fit with the Biden administration's agenda. So what's your sense of all that? The agency that Zelensky actually has and the extent of U.S. influence over his decisions?
Zelensky was elected by a landslide, not because of anything except he wasn't all the other candidates. So his political capital very quickly evaporated, and he really had no power to make decisions. Whether there were other people behind him making decisions or that he mouthed, or whether he was taking instructions from the Biden administration or the Trump administration or whoever, is unclear. But what is clear to me is that Mr. Zelensky's heroic performance as the leader of wartime Ukraine has gained him enormous political capital. He has the ability now to make a compromise. It will not be easy. As you indicated, there are elements in the coalition that supports him who are very right-wing and anti-Russian, perhaps even neo-Nazi. And by the way, anti-Semitism is a disastrous aspect of Nazism, but it's not the definition of Nazism. Apparently, you can be a Nazi and have a Jewish president and not feel uncomfortable about it. I think this simplistic argument that, well, because Ukraine has a secular Jewish president who apparently doesn't really identify as Jewish, but is identified as Jewish, this means somehow that there can't be any Nazis backing him. It's ridiculous. Anyway, clearly Ukraine has been very divided in multiple directions ever since its independence. And I'm sure those fissures continue to exist. Mr. Zelensky, however, he really has empowered himself, I think, if he gets backing from the United States and others. And here we have a problem. Not only do we have the Putin is a war criminal and must be brought to trial statements coming out of leaders in the West, including President Biden, but we also have people like Boris Johnson saying the sanctions have to stay on whatever Russia does, because Russia has to be punished. Well, this means Russia has absolutely no incentive to accommodate, and it also means that Mr. Zelensky has no freedom to accommodate. So this is the opposite of an effort to resolve the issue. It's an effort, in effect, whatever its intent, to perpetuate the fighting, and that is going to be disastrous for the Ukrainians, for the Russians, and for Europe, and ultimately for the United States.
You mentioned the neo-Nazi issue in Ukraine. Let me quote you from a new article in the Washington Post by Rita Katz. She's the executive director of the Site Intelligence Group. Her article is called "Neo-Nazis Are Exploiting Russia's War in Ukraine for Their Own Purposes. Not since ISIS have we seen such a flurry of recruitment activity." And she writes this: "In many ways, the Ukraine situation reminds me of Syria in the early and middle years of the last decade. Just as the Syrian conflict served as the perfect breeding ground for groups like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, similar conditions may be brewing in Ukraine for the far right." I'm wondering your response to that.
Well, I think she's got logic on her side. I frankly don't know Ukraine personally well enough to know exactly what the definition of a member of the Azov Brigade or other neo-Nazi groups is. I think right-wing populism is ugly enough in our own country. to imagine that it's even uglier in a country as divided as Ukraine. And I don't dismiss the whole thing at all, because Ukraine has a horrible history of running pogroms, first against Jews and then, frankly, against Russians. And so to dismiss the argument that there are people with violent tendencies and great prejudice, ethnic prejudices, involved in this fight, seems to me to be wrong. So I hadn't read the article you cited. I don't know the author, but she makes sense to me.
And I'm curious what you make now of the allegations we're getting from both the US and Russia against the other, that the other side is plotting false flag chemical attacks. This has only surfaced in recent days. In the case of the US, it strikes me that they're recycling a playbook that they employed under the Obama administration, which was there were people inside the Obama White House who wanted to put out the option of military intervention, and the red line was a good way to pursue that. I'm wondering if you think the Biden administration, especially the remnants of the Obama administration, Blinken, Sullivan, and Biden himself, are recycling that playbook.
I certainly hope not, but it does have a resemblance to the probably false flag use of chemical weapons in Syria. And it almost worked in Syria. It was only at the last minute when the chief of the Joint Chiefs said to the president, this isn't a slam dunk. There are real questions here. And the questions were about whether this was the Turkish and Saudi or whoever false flag intended to force an American escalation over Syria. It was only when that happened that Mr. Obama decided that he should remember the Constitution, which he once taught about, which says that only the Congress can authorize a war. The president does not have the constitutional authority to do that. Of course, in practice, presidents since Truman have done so. But he put it to the Congress, and the Congress behaved in its usual craven fashion and ducked the issue. And he said it's unfair to ask us to do our constitutional duty. So we won't, once again. And so, that almost worked in Syria. And this could well be a replay. From a military point of view, I can't see any reason that the Russians would want to use chemical weapons. Usually they are a defensive device against a mass attack, but there's no such thing going on in Ukraine. They don't need chemical weapons. They have enough frightful weapons of other types without having to do that. So this does strike me as, on its surface, it's suspicious.